Former President Donald Trump says that he could be okay with going to jail. Trump, who on Thursday was found guilty on all 34 counts in the hush money trial, told Fox News Network he is okay with the possibility of going to jail as a result of the trial. Let's watch.
The judge could decide to say, hey, house arrest or even jail.
It could.
How do you face what that could be?
I'm okay with it. I saw one of my lawyers the other day on television saying, oh, no, you don't want to do that to the president. I said, you don't beg for anything. You just, the way it is.
Here's a bit more from Trump on the case against him.
Take a look at who opened the case. I'm not allowed to talk about it because I have a gag order. I'm probably, I guess, the first presidential nominee and the leading crooked Joe by a lot that's not allowed to talk. Maybe they're doing me a big favor, who knows? But I'm not allowed to talk. I'm gagged. Nobody's ever heard of it. It's all coming out. It's weaponization, and it's a very dangerous thing. We've never had that in this country.
I hear a Pride Month meme in that Trump says, I'm gagged. All right. Trump also warned that it might be a breaking point for Americans if he's put behind bars.
I don't know that the public would stand it. I'm not sure the public would stand for it. With a,
you say if they tried house arrest or
I think it would be tough for the public to take. At a certain point, there's a breaking point.
Some in the anti-Trump camp salivating over last week's ruling, with one Twitter account called I Smoked Trump on 34 criminal counts, retweeting a post from Dark Brandon, an account that often mocks Donald Trump, showing a fake photo of Joe Biden with an ice cream cone holding out an L.
All right, so there are divided opinions about the likelihood of Trump actually going to prison. The New York Times had some experts on running through this, and I think they offer a good kind of sketch just from reporting yesterday. One expert, Norman Eisen, he makes the case that in the most serious business record violations of this type, jail time is frequently assigned in the most serious kinds of cases, and that this represents one of the most serious of this variety given the context of it being done in furtherance of keeping the truth from the public in order to mislead them and win a national election. He says that about 10% of the total cases incarceration was imposed, and if you believe this makes it into the top 10%, then there's no reason why this wouldn't have jail time attached to it. He also makes the case that because Trump hasn't shown any contrition and in fact has continued to violate gag orders and the like throughout the process, that the argument for leniency isn't really there. On the other hand, an expert, Nancy Gertner, argues basically some version of the same, but takes different conclusions away from it, saying that only in 10% of these cases is jail time actually attached. There are these sort of like democracy implications at work here that you don't get in most cases. What does it mean to throw a leading presidential candidate in jail even for a short period of time? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think it's obviously a very weighty decision. I mean, Trump almost acting there from, if we're actually making a political calculus, he seems to, I think, openly be wondering if getting put in jail over this is good for him. It makes certainly fires up his base. I mean, but Republicans who think this was unjust, what they're doing to him, can only vote for him once. They're all voting for him. They are excited about it. How it affects the undecided swing or moderate voter who's maybe not enthused with Trump, do they say, as some evidence in polls suggests, well, I wouldn't vote for a convicted felon, a jailed president, I wouldn't vote for it? Or is it the opposite? Or do they say, man, they are throwing everything at Donald Trump to try to make it impossible for people to vote for him, and I object to the system being done to him, that this was a or ought to have been a misdemeanor, ought to have been a minor issue, and they have thrown the book at him because this is the weaponized justice system? Do even people who aren't so enthused about Trump see things that way? Trump also said on Truth Social, which is always impossible to find, but I did finally find it excerpted and put on Twitter, where it should be. I wish he was just on Twitter to make our lives a little bit easier. He writes, the sentencing for not having done anything wrong will be conveniently for the fascists. 4 days before the Republican National Convention, a radical left Soros-backed DA who ran on a platform of I will get Trump, reporting to an acting local judge appointed by the Democrats who's highly conflicted, will make a decision which will determine the future of our nation. The United States Supreme Court must decide, calling on the Supreme Court to do something about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I see Trump really leaning into this was kind of a witch hunt framing. I do think the problem here is that this was a state case, not a federal case. preventing him from making as clear and strong an argument that this was Joe Biden's doing, and also that he was found guilty on all 34 counts by a jury of his peers, a jury process that his lawyers obviously had a part in, making in the voir dire and decision-making process there. So while certainly that's not foolproof, and any advocate for criminal justice reform will tell you all the ways in which prosecutors are benefited in these kinds of scenarios, right. I do also think it's a messier argument for Donald Trump than he might otherwise make. To your earlier point about how this is going to affect voters, of course, that is a $64,000 question. The problem with it is, with understanding what the outcomes are going to be, is that the polls that were taken about this, when you ask people about hypotheticals in the future, they have very little predictive value. But here's what we do know. This is reading from CNN. An NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll conducted during the trial and released before Thursday's verdict found that 67% of registered voters predicting that a guilty verdict would make no difference in their vote. 67 say it's no difference. Now, 7% of Trump's current supporters predicted that they would be less likely to vote for him if he were convicted. Now, there's a bunch of other numbers flying around. People who already like Trump who say it's not going to make any difference. People who already dislike Trump saying that it would make them more likely to vote against him. None of that matters because those are all people who are already pretty confirmed. What we care about are those 7% of Trump's current supporters who predicted they would be less likely to vote for him. And given how narrow these margins still are, that isn't nothing. And I also do wonder if there is a category of people who simply chose not to pay that close attention to this while the verdict was still up in the air because they have other things to do. But now that there's actually been a guilty verdict, well, maybe now they'll start to look at the facts of the case, and maybe that also will not make Donald Trump look very good in their eyes.
Yeah, look, if he loses 7% of the people who are going to vote for him, if they end up not voting for him and they're in Michigan and Pennsylvania, then he will lose the election. Like, it doesn't matter if it's a small number of people. A small number of people will decided the last two elections and will decide them again if they happen to fall in those 5 states that make the difference. I have some, and it sounds like you do too. So, some skepticism that he is actually going to lose that number of people. Certainly, I'm seeing Democratic strategists advising everyone on social media who wants Trump to lose to say, call him convicted felon, former President Donald Trump. Say convicted felon, say that word, say those words over and over and over and over again. So I think it'll be interesting to see some weeks from now if that strategy has changed his polling at all.
And there's a lot of frustration from Democrats that Joe Biden isn't beating that drum more loudly. People have already started calling for Joe Biden to emphasize more that Donald Trump is a convicted felon, and he seems to have had a relatively light Trump touch so far. Unclear if that's going to change. Just one other point that was made by the I don't think he's going to jail person in the New York Times, Nancy Gertner. She also pointed out that when the judge was putting into effect these gag orders, he had the choice also to impose jail sentences as opposed to just fines. And so the choice to do just fines might also be a reflection of having that kind of democracy problem in the back of his head and saying, I want to avoid putting the presidential candidate in prison. Whether that again now extends to this final sentence remains to be seen. Stick around. More Rising coming up next.